Felix Mendelssohn. I love Mendelssohn, and sometimes I feel as though he's been somewhat underappreciated. It's interesting to note that between the years of 1809 and 1811, several great composers were born: Mendelssohn, Chopin, Schumann, and Liszt, as well as Mendelssohn. George Bernard Shaw said, quote, "If you want to find out the weak places in a pianist's technique, ask him to play 10 bars of Mozart or Mendelssohn," unquote. Mendelssohn's music does require a certain clarity and refinement. It is unruffled, discreet, harmonious, and balanced. Missing is the impetuosity of Schumann, but he could write impassioned music, as he did, for example, in his quartet Opus 80 in F minor when his sister Fanny died. Mendelssohn was not narcissistic and is not like Schumann interested in all that self-reflection and self-revelation. It was his letters that were more likely to reveal his inner thoughts than his music. Even though he uttered that famous phrase about music expressing thoughts much better than words could do, he could write in words very well too, and his letters to his family were articulate and colorful descriptions of his travel experiences, interspersed with exquisitely rendered sketches of his surroundings when he traveled, and snippets even of compositions that he had in his head that were inspired by, for example, the Hebrides Islands, Scotland, and later Italy. Even in his music, Mendelssohn was more of an observer and a painter in tones than an analyzer. Now, some people find this reductive, that he, quote, simply made tone poems. But in Mendelssohn's case, some of us believe that he used the natural landscape as a metaphor for his inner landscape. For example, the mysteries of the Hebrides Islands and Fingal's Cave, the open joy of his Scottish and Italian symphonies, the playfulness and ecstasy of Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, all expressive of different states of mind. He was an enormously gifted person. He could speak, read, and write in at least 5 languages, and was attracted to and inspired by literary works, as were Schumann and Schubert. He was not overly sentimental or self-indulgent. In fact, all his short life, he had an ethic of hard work, even though he could quite comfortably have been complacent and never had to struggle to make a living. A bit of bio is necessary here. Felix Mendelssohn was born into a very distinguished Jewish family, which is mentionable only because of the obstacles his family had to overcome. There is an actual town record of his grandfather, Moses Mendelssohn, a hunchback, impoverished son of a scribe, entering the Servants' Gate into Berlin in 1743 at age 14. The record reads, quote, 6 oxen, 7 swine, and 1 Jew, unquote, having walked 80 miles from Dessau. And this malformed young pauper ultimately became one of Europe's greatest philosophers and scholars of the Enlightenment period. Then Moses was ultimately designated a Schutzjude, a protected Jew, which spared the family some of the humiliations, but not to the extent that Felix, Fanny, and their siblings were not stoned in the streets, scorned, derided, so that they had to ask their parents, "Is it shameful to be a Jew?" Years after his death, Richard Wagner wrote that the life and works of Mendelssohn clearly demonstrated that no Jew, however gifted and cultural and honorable, was capable of creating art that moved the heart and soul. And years later, he urged Germany to oust every Jew, offering the massacres in Russia as an example worthy of imitation. Some 50 years later, the Nazis destroyed the beautiful Mendelssohn monument in Leipzig, hacking it to pieces. But in spite of this unbelievable handicap of having to endure and surmount rampant anti-Semitism, Felix and Fanny were able to grow up in an atmosphere of high culture. Felix's mother, Leah, was highly educated, played the piano very well, and read Homer in the original classic Greek, among her other many accomplishments. And the beautiful home that their father, Abraham, was able to procure after establishing a very successful business attracted the greatest musicians, poets, artists, and thinkers of the age. Of course, Abraham had to convert the family to Lutheranism, adding the name Bartholdy after Mendelssohn, in order to be allowed to continue to reside in their home in Berlin. But Mendelssohn later took his own prerogative and frequently omitted this appendage to his name. And because he rose to such a respected level, he flourished in spite of it. Most music historians acknowledge that Mendelssohn was, by far, the more gifted child prodigy than Mozart. By 16, Mendelssohn had composed some of his best work, including his octet for strings, the piano concerto in G minor, not only melodies and transparent textures, but large-scale structures with ease and inherent grace, whereas Mozart's early work is not really memorable. Also, Mendelssohn's early work was entirely from his own creative ability, whereas Mozart's early work was greatly coached and enhanced by his father. The young Felix was taken to visit the great poet Goethe, who took Felix under his wing and relished every visit from the family to Weimar. In turn, Mendelssohn referred to Goethe as the, quote, imperial son of my life. Son spelled S-U-N, of course. One time, it is said, Goethe handed the young Felix a manuscript of a Mozart adagio to play. The poet had heard the 7-year-old Mozart 60 years earlier, and here was Felix playing Wolfgang to him. But then Goethe handed an unsigned manuscript of scribbles and blots and scratchings out to stump the boy. And Felix started reading and playing from the manuscript, then stopped and explained, "This is Beethoven. I should know it anywhere." But Goethe did not admire nor understand Beethoven's music, and during one visit, Mendelssohn insisted that the old poet sit and listen until he finally acknowledged that Beethoven was great. I should add that Fanny pleased the elder poet very much too, with her performances of 24 Bach preludes and fugues from memory during the first of several meetings with him. With all the anti-Semitism and challenges, Mendelssohn is often mischaracterized, even so, as having had only bliss and no struggle in his life. He was, on the whole, what we might refer to as an ecstatic, responding to the world around him on a high-pitched frequency of gratitude and gladness. His piano music is distinguished by its lightness and capricious character, almost as evoking the kingdom of Oberon, as in his overture and E minor scherzo to Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, where we can hear gossamer wings flitting all over the place. This is a quality we should hear as well in the Rondo Capriccioso and other piano works. But his music is much more than playful and happy, which I hope you will hear in the Variations Serieuses. Mendelssohn did basically have a sunny disposition, but he had his down periods as well, most notably when a series of his operas were not well received, and he was being appreciated mostly for his pianism, along with his scholarship in bringing Bach's great choral works to light, after they had lain fallow for 100 years, as difficult to imagine as that may be. Mendelssohn could also fly into a rage when conducting an orchestra and having to deal with mediocre musicians playing out of tune. There are also descriptions of his piano classes at the conservatory and his furious response to carelessness or irreverence for the composer, his earnest reproaches for lack of sonority or lack of expressiveness. Mendelssohn and Schumann were both deeply affected by late Beethoven, but perhaps one of Mendelssohn's shortcomings was that his music was perhaps too well balanced. He rounded off the lengths of his phrases and kept things nice and tidy, resolved and happy and clear, whereas the unresolved nature and uneven lengths of Beethoven's phrasing provided unrest, tension, and passion. Schumann, by the way, was much closer to Beethoven in the untidy and unresolved nature of his phrases. From Bach, Mendelssohn drew the element of recitatives, which appear in a lot of his music. And in all of Mendelssohn, his great symphonies, the Scottish, Italian, and Reformation, the choral music like Elijah, the Variations Serieuses, and so much of his chamber music, he found his own personal voice with its own deeply expressive beauty, even if it is less complex and more amiable. When composers borrow ideas or are influenced by other composers, they usually either subconsciously weave the influences into their music, and we either realize the source or not. But when Mendelssohn was inspired by another composer or used the germ of an idea from someone else, he acknowledges and displays it with pride and then expounds upon it, kind of paying open homage to the source. Mendelssohn's favorite place to be, which he uttered again and again, was at home with his family in his own garden in Leipzig. However, he traveled extensively and happily because he was invited to conduct and play all over Europe, and he was happier almost anywhere but in Berlin. When Mendelssohn went to England, his second home, he was accepted into and celebrated by the highest rungs of society, inspiring some of his greatest works, including Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, who invited him into their palace, where he played for hours. He also loved Italy and raved about Switzerland, where he reveled in the nature and painted some of his loveliest watercolors. During one visit, he painted at the same sites with Turner, Ruskin, and Corot. Mendelssohn's paintings have the same light and airy touch that is analogous to the touch required for playing his music. In fact, one of the greatest challenges of playing Mendelssohn concerns the touch. His scherzo effects, such as in the Rondo Capriccioso, the Octet, the Midsummer Night's Dream, his concertos, and some of the variations in the Variations Serieuses, have an especially airy, light staccato, bouncy movement, usually in the higher registers. The pianist has to strive for evenness and a refinement and clarity while keeping up an unerring pulse. This is all a question of balance and control. What do I mean by balance and control? Well, in this music, as there are so many notes, the first reality is that they are not all created equal. There is a beginning of a phrase, an end, and contours within the phrases. There are nuanced dynamic contrasts even within the narrow range of light passage work, and the rubato must be minimal to keep the momentum. It is essential to remember that the Romantic composers, Chopin, Schumann, Brahms, Liszt, Mendelssohn, were punctilious in writing in generous indications for fluctuations in the tempo, sometimes using the words espressivo, sostenuto, ritenuto, allargando, accelerando, stretto, calando, all of which imply fluctuations, albeit approaching it from varying philosophical angles. So it is advisable that the pianist keep his or her own impulses down to a minimum. It is also, as I like to stress, important to know the exact Italian definitions for each indication on the score. For example, ritenuto, ritardando, allargando, calando are all indications of ebbing, slowing down, fading out, and yet philosophically they are altogether different. Ritenuto means holding back. Ritardando means slowing down. Allargando means widening. And calando means dying out. In the end, they're all slowing down, but if you know the philosophical meaning, you approach it in a different way, and it ought to come out slightly different according to the exact Italian meaning. Much of Mendelssohn's piano pieces, whether for solo or ensemble, are, as I mentioned, dense with millions of notes for the pianist. I recall playing the sonata for cello and piano at Yale with my son, Dennis Parker, many years ago, and lamenting the number of notes to my friend, the pianist Peter Frankel, who was on the piano faculty at Yale. And he replied in jest to reassure me, "I'm sure Felix didn't mean for us to play all those notes." Well, Felix did mean for us to play all the notes, and Peter knew that very well, and I did too. Actually, Mendelssohn understood the hand very well on the piano, and those patterns and intricate passages have to be practiced very slowly, articulating and engraving them into the hand with good, rational fingering before we can dance our fingers around them at full tempo. Otherwise, the notes amount to what I like to call typing. Mendelssohn abhorred virtuoso playing for its own sake. Quote, "These piano acrobats give me less pleasure than rope dancers or circus acrobats. They do not endanger their lives, but they endanger our ears." Unquote. The best way to practice technique is with the musical meaning behind every gesture. It's my only and best advice. When Felix's sister Fanny died, his own health began to decline, insidiously and mysteriously, as though the two souls had been connected by energies and currents linking their brains. And just several months later, Felix died at the age of 38 from the same kind of brain condition, similar to a stroke that took his father, grandfather, and sister. When the news had spread to England that Mendelssohn died, Queen Victoria wrote in her journal, quote, "We were horrified, astounded, and distressed to read in the papers of the death of Mendelssohn, the greatest musical genius since Mozart, and the most amiable man. He was quite worshipped by those who knew him intimately, and we have so much appreciated and admired his wonderfully beautiful compositions. We liked and esteemed the excellent man, and looked up to and revered his wonderful genius and the great mind, which I fear were too much for the frail and delicate body. With it all, He was so modest and simple. The musical selection in this chapter is the Variations Serieuses. In 1841, Mendelssohn wrote an excited letter to a friend. "Can you guess what I have just been composing, and passionately? Variations for piano, 18 of them on a theme in D minor, and I had such enormous fun writing them." Unquote. He chose a humble, plaintive tune. He even called it peevish, and he embroidered it in a serious, sober way, building upon it with every conceivable novel idea. There had certainly been previously composed great and serious, quote, sets of variations, most notably Bach's Goldberg, Beethoven's Diabelli, and Eroica variations, Haydn's F minor variations, but most variations were filled with empty brilliance for the sheer sake of virtuoso displays and not too deep. Chopin's Laci de Rem variations were pretty but frivolous, and it is doubtful whether Mendelssohn had heard Schumann's Etude Symphonique. Brahms's great variations were yet to come. Mendelssohn's resulting Variations Serieuses, Opus 54, ranks with the finest variations and would influence such composers as Brahms and César Franck. Each short variation morphs into the next, and they are multi-layered and anything but frivolous. They are virtuosic and demanding, but again never for display purposes, as Mendelssohn scorned that value in others. In fact, while practicing some of the most tricky variations, I found that what I tell my students is positively invaluable, that only by thinking musically does the key, the clue to the technical challenge become apparent. The 18 variations hold together as an organic whole because the piece is so perfectly well balanced and beautifully crafted. Each tempo and mood is beautifully set within the context, with almost an inevitability of the sequences, and it is a great joy to play, both as a pianist and a musician. This piece demonstrates all the facets of Mendelssohn's character. There are the 48 Songs Without Words, published in 8 volumes, and when asked what he meant by writing wordless songs, Mendelssohn replied, "The song is just as it stands. Even if I had a particular word or words in mind, I would not want to tell anyone, because the same word means different things to different people. Only the song says the same thing, arouses the same feeling in everyone, a feeling that cannot be discussed or expressed in words." Probably no piano music has been performed more frequently and sometimes quite amateurishly in the drawing rooms of Europe than those Songs Without Words. They have sometimes been called slight because they are miniatures, but never insignificant, and some are strikingly original. In among the albums are barcarolles, spinning songs, folk songs, hunting songs, and so on. They are like miniature tone poems, little paintings or vignettes. Actually, Mendelssohn wrote large tone poems like the Hebrides Overture, about which Brahms said, "I would gladly give all I have written to have composed something like the Hebrides Overture." Unquote. So generous. The philosophic question that is often asked is, can we be content with, quote, simple beauty and sheer happiness with no conflict or puzzles? Some people feel that much of Mendelssohn charms the listener, but does not astonish. For my part, I think there is a perfect place in this chaotic world for simple beauty and sheer happiness.